to give a research-related talk and policy-related talk about the university's perspective, the researchers' perspective on what this issue is that's coming up in the media. And so with the issues that have come up around children at the border, I reached out to Kate Rosenblum and said, would you be willing to host a rapid response talk program? And to my great joy, Kate agreed. So Kate is on the executive committee of Center for Human Growth and Development, and she's a clinical professor of psychiatry here at the University. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to introduce.
Thank you so much, and welcome. I'm so heartened. These are the things that give me hope right now. And I think really appreciate the opportunity to ask these wonderful and esteemed colleagues to come together to share with us work that they are doing that is relevant, I think, to this discussion. And we will hear from each person briefly, and following that, have time for a moderated discussion and potentially some Q&A at the end. So I will just start by saying this event is co-sponsored by an initiative that is relatively newer at the University of Michigan called our Zero to Thrive initiative, and represents a launching of a collaboration between the Center for Human Growth and Development and the Zero to Thrive initiative. And we're really excited about that. And part of what that means is that the discussion today is going to reflect more broadly than just the research, but also we've invited people who have translational interests and who are doing work in policy and advocacy and in research to sort of represent the full array of work. And this is consistent with the mission of Zero to Thrive, which is to transform the lives of young, vulnerable children and their families through multi-generational initiatives that harness the academic strengths of the University of Michigan more broadly, engage communities, train the next generation of providers, and promote the long-term health and resilience of populations through research, partnership, and service. And we would welcome any of you who feel like that sounds exciting to me. I'm at the University of Michigan, and I'd love to be connected to that, to come up and talk to us. Allison Miller can wave, and Maria Music, you can wave, and I all co-lead this initiative. I'm going to launch us, before others on the panel present, with just sharing a little bit about sort of what we know from some of the work that I've been doing about the impact, the potential costs of separations, and the challenges of reunions based on work I've been doing with military families. I'll say a little bit more about that. But I'm curious, if any of you have had the same experience of driving in your car, NPR playing, and someone comes on the radio and says, the kids are going to be fine. They're being cared for. They're in a nice facility. Actually, they have better schooling now than they had before, right? Or someone says, it's okay, we'll take care of them, and they'll eventually be reunited, right? And so this idea that somehow in the popular sort of press or conception, there is a sense that separations maybe don't have the impact that I think science and policy and experience lead us to sort of understand is necessarily there. And so I think this becomes an issue for all of us in terms of thinking about how is the work that we are doing informing public discourse and popular understanding of the likely impact of these experiences. And I think military families actually have quite a lot to say about the impact of separation and reunion. And I want to share with you some of their voices just to set the stage for these presentations. So the work that I have done over the past decades really has pretty much entirely focused on processes of disruption and repair in relationships. Separation from a parent or a caregiver can be understood as a disruption in that relationship, and this has consequences, particularly for even very young kids. All separations are not equivalent. We'll start with that sort of understanding. But what we do see is that separations and reunions pose challenges and are associated, for example, with stress responses even for very young infants. For those of you who are in developmental science sort of fields, we have tons of data looking at processes of disruption and repair. Some of our most commonly used methods, the strange situation to assess attachment, the still face, involve separating parents and reunifying them with their kids and looking at how they negotiate that as a challenge, right? And what we've learned from that is that there is stress associated with those separations and that the process of reunion takes time and is associated with mixed emotions, and the process of sort of returning to baseline requires support. We also know a tremendous amount about the experiences of individuals who experience more significant disruptions. And this comes from areas of work on foster care, parental incarceration, adoption, military families, to name a few, and we'll be hearing about some of this today. It is important for us all to acknowledge that there is a popular misconception that separations don't impact infants and young kids. To my mind, this is shocking because of the work I do. But I can't tell you how many times, for example, I've presented to judges or caseworkers or others, and they've said, well, thank goodness he's so little, he won't remember it, right? When actually I think the science would point us in exactly the opposite direction. So in this work on separations and disruptions and repair, some of the work I've done is with military families. And in the context of that work, we've had the opportunity to talk to actually hundreds of parents who are service members, veterans, or spouses about their experience parenting during deployment and reunion. And from those experiences, we've learned a tremendous amount about the cost of family separations. And if I had to sort of share the big punchline, it's that even with time to prepare and support, separations and reunions do pose unique challenges for families with young kids. My colleague Tova Walsh, who was a former grad student here now at the University of Washington, and I actually wrote an op-ed for The Hill on this topic. For those of you less familiar with military family life, I will say there are three phases that also sort of repeat themselves often and overlap associated with deployment. The first being the pre-deployment phase, where families prepare for that separation. The second being the deployment phase, where the focus is on coping and sustaining relationships over time and space. And the third is reintegration, which involves the process of reconnection and repairing the disruption. So I just want to share a few bullet points from the qualitative analysis of those hundreds of interviews that emerge as common themes. First, in the pre-deployment phase, before getting orders to deploy, parent service members are keenly aware of the possibility that they might deploy. And this is both a source of worry and a pressure to sort of be prepared. On receiving orders, we see that families really move quickly into the process of preparation. And this includes both practical preparation, getting affairs in order, arranging for childcare, and emotional preparations. Things like trying to make sure that you're making the most of the time you have together, creating memories that will sustain relationships while apart, talking about deployment, and efforts to allay child worries and offer reassurance. This is, however, nonetheless quite stressful. In the words of one deploying mother of 2 young kids, everything was challenging because I was a mom, right? With me being gone, how would they manage? During deployment, parents also described many impacts of the separation. They frequently told us, for example, that their young children had difficulty understanding their parents' absence, difficulty adjusting to new childcare, feared for their missing parents' safety, became more clingy to the at-home parent, and demonstrated stress in a variety of ways. And in addition, the deployed and at-home parents experienced stressors, worry about the safety of a deployed partner, how the parent at home is managing, and worries about the child grief and fear. So in the words of one deployed mother, I pretty much was in a total panic for the entire time. The planning I did sounds fantastic, except you just can't prepare for everything. However, and this is worth noting, if you're already sort of finding yourself thinking about how does this relate to what's happening for families now in the United States in different circumstances, it's important to note that military families often get support. The The separation is acknowledged, and families often acknowledged and appreciated the efforts that the military made to sustain relationships and connections. For example, by making video conferencing available, or having parents who are deployed record bedtime stories for their kids. During reintegration, new challenges arise. So families let us know over and over again that despite the popular YouTube moments of reunion, woo, we're so happy. Oh, I was going to show you the Detroit News and Free Press today. You know, those are the equivalent, like, woohoo, we're reconnected, right? But what they wanted us to know, this is a process, not a moment. Children are often angry or fearful that their parents will leave again and may have difficulty tolerating even brief separations. Parents often had made extensive efforts over an extended period to rebuild trust and security. And this was harder when someone in the family was experiencing trauma or other mental health symptoms. So one father who actually met criteria for PTSD described his response to hearing his toddler cry. And he said, at times, I just feel like going outside just so I don't have to hear it, because it just gets to be too hard to bear. All that stuff plays back into my PTSD. So I'm not going to share extensively about this, but what I want to sort of leave you with is military families are actually tremendously resilient. And we've had the opportunity to really understand from them how they make this process of repair and reconnection. And we've developed a preventive intervention for families called Strong Military Families, bringing people together and supporting them in that process of interactive repair. But I think, and I hope that you also will appreciate, that there are a number of implications as we hear these voices for thinking about families separated at the border. First of all, that there is a danger in treating separations of parents and young children casually. Secondly, when separations occur, preparation and support for maintaining connection during those periods of separation can be tremendously valuable. Reintegration takes time, and efforts to facilitate and support interactive repair may be helpful. And I think there are networks of people thinking about that for the families currently separated on the border. And then given the likelihood of traumatic stress reactions, the availability of trauma-informed treatment is really critical. So I will leave, those are my thoughts about the implications. I'll be curious to hear other people's thoughts over time, but I really want to transition into introducing now our panel, who will help us to think about this in new and rich ways from different perspectives, ranging from neuroscience to practice to policy. So let me first start by introducing Jacek Debit. He is an assistant professor of psychiatry, both the psychiatry and the MBNI, the Molecular and Behavioral Neuroscience Institute. He is received his MD in, I'm going to not pronounce the name of your university correctly. Jacek, I'm sorry, Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, where he completed a psychiatric residency and doctoral studies in transcultural psychiatry. He also holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Philosophy of Science from the Pontifical University in Krakow. As a Fulbright Fellow, he trained in neuroscience with Joseph Ledoux at New York University, where he completed his second residency in psychiatry and fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry. His lab investigates how early life trauma affects attachment and how healthy attachment and bonding protect from the effects of trauma. His group works on identifying neural circuits and molecular mechanisms underlying infant vulnerability and resilience to psychological trauma, with the ultimate goal of developing interventions reversing negative effects of these early adversities. His work has been published in top scientific journals and featured by numerous national and international media. And so we are very lucky to have you here to present, and I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Jacek.
Thank you, Kate, for this very kind introduction. Yes. This is mine. Okay, correct. Thank you. So I would like to first maybe apologize to those of you who heard me speaking, because there will be some repetition, and some of the pieces of information some of you may be already familiar with. So no, is this? No, thank you. Midway press. I'm also trying not to be technical in describing some basic science studies, so I will focus on concepts and give some examples. But I'll be open to any questions, and if I know the answer, I'll be happy to answer or refer you to other sources. First, I would like to thank my lab who contributed to the work, some of the work I'll be presenting here, and also my sponsors of my research. I have nothing to disclose. I have no external interests. So I do think that maybe we should give a little bit of a credit of people who brought our attention to attachment and separation, and I listed only a few names, but there are more. Probably everybody here heard about Bowlby, who studied maladapted and delinquent children, found that they had history of separation from caregivers. Mary Ainsworth, who was from Ohio, so not far from here, who studied mother-infant interactions, focused on communication, emotion regulation, response to perceived threats. A stranger situation that we use in developmental psychology or clinical psychology. She is credited. Harry Harlow, who Wisconsin, also not far, looks like the Midwest, had this awareness and passion for studying early development. So Harry Harlow studied in monkeys separation, and he found that infants separated from mothers are reclusive, display some social deficits. They clung to their clothed diapers. Probably maybe one of the most appealing examples of his studies when he separated monkey from the mother and had these surrogate monkeys, kind of like either a wired monkey made out of wire with a source of food versus monkey that was made of cloth, so just kind of gentle touch, but without food. So monkeys, the infants, would rather stay with the surrogate that was made out of cloth. So even the cost of being food deprived. So this is how much the physical contact is really important. And then we have René Spitz, a psychoanalyst who observed that maternal deprivation leads to deterioration in human infants. And work of these people, these giants and others, work to the formulation of the attachment theory that mostly Bowlby is credited with, that children are born pre-programmed to form attachments with others. And the attachment is essential, key experience, key stage in our development. But I would like to focus on safe and threat learning in the context of attachment. And we can imagine that for purposes of survival, one of the most important things to learn what is safe and what is dangerous. Yes, if we don't learn that, if we don't learn it quickly, then we are in trouble. So this safety and threat learning are critical throughout life, but also our tuning to the word is kind of based on this threat and safety learning. Moreover, our interaction with the word determines how safe and threat learning further in life occur. But the first thing to learn is attachment learning. And if I want to emphasize, attachment is learning. When we're saying that children are pre-programmed, they are pre-programmed to the experience that occurs during the interaction between an infant and a caretaker. And we have evidence that attachment actual learning occurs before birth in humans. We have also evidence in animals. So one of the studies focus on the nipple attachment. shows that children, when they are born, babies, newborns, they recognize the smell of the nipple of the mother. So the milk, this first milk, colostrum contains some chemicals that are present in the amniotic fluid. So there is certain learning that is occurring all the in utero, and babies, newborns, they crawl to the nipple because there's something familiar about the nipple, the smell. So that's like in brief about safety learning. Now, how is threat learning studied? Probably also most of you are familiar with these experimental protocols, like fear conditioning, in which we have pointer here. So we have a neutral stimulus, let's say smell and odor, and which is paired with the aversive stimulus like mild electric shock. Doesn't cause any physical harm. But when you pair this neutral stimulus, smell, sound with something aversive, then the animals develop fear responses to this neutral stimulus. So that's fear conditioning. Top button. Top button. Yeah, right. This one here. Thank you very much. And we know kind of relatively a lot about this threat learning circuit. We know that one of the key players is the amygdala. This is where the information about this neutral stimulus and the aversive stimulus converge. And the amygdala sends projections to other brain areas and controls stress and fear responses. So we have central nervous system, medullary systems involved, brainstem areas that regulate freezing behaviors or escape behaviors. And we have also projections to the hypothalamus that the part of the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland axis, so stress response axis. Now, so this was about threat. How is safe learning studied in experimental setting? One thing is that we can do the fear conditioning procedure, and then we can reintroduce this initially neutral cue that was conditioned multiple times, without the reinforcer, without this aversive stimulus, and over time the few responses to this cue, conditioned cue, will extinguish. So the animal unlearns, so learns that this cue is not threatening, does not predict threat anymore. It's safe. Another method is we expose the animal to the cue. The animal becomes familiar with the cue. The cue does not predict any threat, and then we subject the animal to something stressful like fear conditioning and present this cue, and this cue will diminish the fear. So that's kind of like a buffering of fear. We know that the presence of conspecifics, of familiar others, buffers fears, buffers stress. That's kind of how it works. Now, there's something interesting about rodent models that my lab studies that is kind of very particular, but I do believe that it reveals some more general truths about development. So when comparing to humans, rodents are kind of born prematurely, so they're less advanced in their development. They cannot see, they cannot hear, their motor development is not as advanced, and around but then they really develop very fast comparing to humans, of course. And around postnatal day 10, they're developed enough so they can start leaving the nest, exploring the area around the nest, before the time they stay in the nest with the mother. Then around postnatal day between 21, 28, in the laboratory setting, it's postnatal day 21. In natural setting, it's a few days later. This is the time when young rats kind of weaned off, so they can leave the nest, but they still stay with the group. So what is really interesting and what rodent studies teach us is that during this period of time when pups are with the mom, there's very rapid attachment learning, and the threat learning system is suppressed. So you can attempt to fear condition, treat with a mild shock pup, and present a neutral cue, but the pup will not acquire fear conditioning. Threat learning is suppressed. On the contrary, there's very robust attachment learning. When I mentioned that when pups are born, they don't hear, then they don't see, but they have very strong sense of smell. So they attach to their mom through the smell. And if during that time you expose the pup to a smell, to a novel smell, they develop attachment to the smell that is lifelong. But this is so strong and so powerful. Something familiar stays for life. And we all know, like how many of us here have in their offices picture of our significant others, our loved ones. It just does make a difference. Yes, the memories that we once made, they're with us. And their memories could be for dishes that we were exposed to early in life, sounds, contexts. What is familiar is safe. In other words, attachment learning is safety learning. That's something which is kind of very critical, because if this phase is disrupted, then we do not develop appropriate safety learning. Then we have a period of time in transition between the time when the pups start exploring the nest and wean off, when they can acquire threat conditioning or fear conditioning, but when the mom is with them, the mom can suppress it. So it's, in other words, it's maternal behavior that kind of teaches them what is threatening, what is safe. And if there's a calm mother with them, it doesn't matter what's happening. Right? It could be, you can shock the pup, mom is there, mom is calm. They will not make memories of this experience because maternal presence is suppressing it. There are some examples that I'm going to kind of tell you later, or maybe I'll mention it now. So when the mom is stressed, then they require fear conditioning, even during this sensitive period. So that's kind of shows us how powerful emotions are in safety and threat learning is, that if the pup is shocked, the pup will not acquire few memories of cues that are associated with the shock. But when the pup is exposed to the scared, stressed mother, and there are associated cues that trigger maternal stress, then they will acquire few responses to this cue. So in other words, we can say metaphorically that the parent caretaker is more important than the world around. It is basically the world. So that's what these studies teach us. This is what I said. Attachment cue is safety cue. What is important that this attachment cues, this maternal smell or these smells that we introduce early in life, they are safety cues throughout life. So if, let's say, if you have an adult rat and you expose the adult rat to the cue that was learned early in life, to the smell that was learned early in life, then the pup, then the adult rat, you reduce stress in the adult rat. This is kind of how our memories, hopefully childhood memories, positive memories, can alter our stress response. So that's, I kind of mentioned about this rapid attachment learning, so I will skip this slide, kind of discuss the neurocircuitry. We can go to it during the discussion. This is the slide showing us how maternal presence regulates fear learning during this transitional period. So when the mom is present, the mom will suppress the stress response, and the mom is absent. We have stress response that modulates fear learning. Now, and if I told you that fear could be early in life acquired more likely through the mother than through interactions with the environment, and indeed, if we expose newborn pups to the stressed mother, we have like all the areas that are involved in stress and pain and fear processing in the pup's brain are activated. In nutritious species, newborns are kind of tuned to caretakers' emotions. And these maternal threats or threat responses that the pups are exposed to in life the pups display these responses throughout life. So basically, when they grow up, they still remember what was scary for the parent. So this is kind of one of the mechanisms of the transmission of threat response. Now, what is maternal separation? What does maternal separation do to threat and learning and safety learning? There are various procedures that are used in rodent studies. We can say kind of in brief that during the first few days of life, pups are taken for 2 to 3 hours away from the mom. They're the temperature, the experimenters make sure that the temperature is not dropping, so they're on a heat pad. They are fed, so they're not deprived from like basic physiological needs, but they're not with the mom. And what does this procedure do? After these few days of for 2 to 3 hours a day of separating an infant from the mother, we observe that these threat processing and learning system mature rapidly. So I told you that this threat learning is suppressed early in life, but if you separate the pup, the threat learning emerges earlier. But this is natural. When the pup is not with the mom, cannot rely on maternal behavior, maternal protection. Pup has to become more independent. So we have this rapid maturation of threat responses. However, it's not just maturation. It's these threat system. They are active, functional earlier, but they're also more rigid. And as a consequence, the few memories formed in infancy are more persistent. So they're kind of more lasting. And there's also the unlearning extinction of fear to the exposure to the cue without the reinforcements by the shock. It's also disrupted. So there is a maturation, but there's a price that we pay for that. Another example that to show you that in these early life adversities, they also disrupt the effects of these. 1 minute, thank you. Almost done. So the effects on safety learning, and they cause like depressive-like behaviors. One of the methods of studying depressive-like behaviors is the forced swim test, when you put the animal to water, and most of the time they will spend some time, they want to find an escape, or they give up. And it's kind of this giving up, it's called learned helplessness. So pups that were separated, they just give up very quickly. They also express anxiety like behaviors and are less likely to explore the novel environment. So what we know, what the neuroscience tells us, that this maternal separation that alters connectivity within the brain threat processing system, the connections between amygdala, other areas like prefrontal cortex are altered, and there's altered stress response, the inhibitory GABAergic circuitry is altered, and various neuromodulatory systems, including oxytocin, vasopressin, dopamine, they're also altered as a consequence of the separation procedure. So in summary, attachment learning is safety learning. Fear learning emerges early in life, but is kind of suppressed because attachment has to occur. Mother can suppress fear learning, and maternal separation alters our safety and threat processing. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thanks. I did the same thing. Thank you so much, Jacek. That's really, yeah, your attachment to this. But you learned. Okay. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Arash Javanbakht. He is a psychiatrist specialized in treatment and research of trauma and anxiety, and he's the director of the Stress, Trauma, and Anxiety Research Clinic at Wayne State in the Department of Psychiatry. He's also here at the University of Michigan as an adjunct assistant professor in psychiatry. His research focuses on neurobiology of trauma and novel methods of treatment for anxiety and PTSD. I'm really excited to have him here because one of his current studies examines the impact of exposure to war trauma and forced migration in 400 Syrian and Iraqi adult and children refugees resettled in the U.S. In this work, prevalence of PTSD, anxiety, and depression, their longitudinal trajectory, and genetic, inflammatory, and environmental correlates are examined. Given difficulties of providing conventional therapies for this population, his group has also developed and is researching the impact of art and movement-based interventions in helping highly traumatized Syrian and Iraqi mothers and children. So please join me in welcoming Arash.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I still see myself as University of Michigan. I graduated like 3 years ago, trained by these awesome people. So when I went to Wayne State, we started this research clinic, and the intention was to have focus both on the research and the clinical side of the trauma. And being in Detroit, we are exposed to a lot of trauma from different groups of people. As you mentioned earlier, one of the comments that people raise is that, well, kids are here now in better places or in better schools, so they shouldn't be worried. Similar comments were made about, well, refugees from the Middle East are now away from the conflict zone. They have been away from their country for a couple of years, so there shouldn't be something serious going on with them. And we didn't know actually the impact. We didn't have the data. So one of the studies that we actually don't have any conflict of interest. One of the studies that we started to run with actually putting together a group of Middle Eastern refugees, a group of physicians who were Iraqi and from other Arab countries, refugees, agreed to volunteer with our work. I was just a junior faculty. We didn't have a lot of funding. And any refugee that comes to the United States within the first month of their arrival, they have to do a medical screening. And there are clinics which have contracts with the Office of Refugee Resettlement that have to do these screenings. So our team would go to those clinics on the days of the physical screening, and they would screen for mental health. Because unfortunately, that's an area that was always put at the last priority, somehow understandably, because they want to make sure that no infectious diseases are coming in and they have the minimum housing and transportation available. So our team started this work, and we got a lot of attention from the media and the scientific community. And the reason I'm showing this slide is that there are ways when we have data to show it to the people, to show it to the policymakers, to share it with the community, to know what's going on. So our cohorts ended up being a large study. So in a relatively short period of time, until the new government stopped the flow of refugees to the country, we recruited more than 94% of people who were referred to us by the primary care physicians. So basically in the clinic, after the physicians saw the patient, participants, they would introduce them to our research and say, hey, do you want to help these guys? And they would come. And actually our biggest rate limiting factor was drivers who were yelling and screaming at us that we have to take them home. So we tried to get as much data as we could at the first phase. Happily, we got some funds and we have a good relationship with the families. Now we are going in their houses after 1 year to look at the illness trajectory, because when we say PTSD is not a solid construct. Symptoms of stress change based on what happens in the environment and internal context. So large number of adults and children, all families. So it seems like refugees from Middle East who end up in America don't seem to be the hardest hit. Almost everybody had all their 4 limbs on. Kids have both of their parents on. I don't know how the vetting happens, but it seems like we get the healthy ones. So whatever we see here may not be the maximum that could exist. So as a clinician, one of the things that I hate about research is concepts turn into humans turn into concepts and numbers. Like I could just continue with saying that, well, we had this number of patients, this percentage, this, and doesn't show the intensity of the problem. So I want to tell you a story. I actually also sometimes see asylum seekers who need an evaluation, psychiatric evaluation for trauma for the court affidavit. And interestingly, I saw a woman who, when she left her country in Latin America, was a teenager. But now when I was interviewing her, she was an adult. Still, it's going to be a story to you until we are able to really put ourselves in their shoes. Meaning that, imagine I'm that teenager, or imagine I'm the father or mother of that teenager who's telling this story. And the story this person told me was, so imagine every morning you send your kids to the school. There were a gang in the neighborhoods, and the gang was running the neighborhoods. And she witnessed a neighbor being decapitated by the gang when she was a child, because that neighbor did not cooperate successfully. The gang would come, she lived with her grandmother. They came, of course, when you're in a very poor neighborhood run by gangs, you don't have a lot of resources to, who knows what's the family structure. So she lived with my grandmother, and there was continuous harassment, threats of kidnapping her, knowing that other neighbors were kidnapped and killed. And on her way to school, she was repeatedly harassed by the gang. They would hold their guns, they would show them, they would say, hey, if your grandma doesn't give the money, kill you, we're going to kidnap you, we're going to rape you. And at times she was touched. This person was not raped, but so it just went on for months and months and years. So she ended, basically her life ended in being just sitting at home, hiding at home, trying to be very low key, and only trying to go to school just to get her education. That was her only encounter with the world outside. When it comes to other refugees, so Syrian refugees, so life in Syria was relatively stable before things started to go bad. It was a relatively stable society for people who were not involved in the politics. And then one day, everything goes down. You don't know who's on which side, and at the moment, the group that is momentarily running the show in your territory, are they against your ethnicity or religion or sub-religion belief or your height or the skin color or whatever? And who's your neighbor now, and what are they with or against? And you see that people, kids and adults, are exposed to all these adversities, including no hygiene, lack of resources, no sanitary water, no health. And then they're moved to camps where life is even harder, because this camp is extremely overcrowded. I'm using the word of a volunteer in one of those camps, that I would not be happy my animal lived in that camp. Couple of years, your family. And it could be like just trying to, again, understand, imagine it. It could be any of us, because like it would be a Syrian doctor that this happened to them, because there was no specific group of people which were separated. And after those 2 years of terrible experiences, having left everything in your house at home, worrying about grandma, worrying about the sister who was killed and you buried there, whatever belonging you had and you left there. And every day, well, you don't know where you're going to end up. Well, one day you get lucky and you get a letter that, well, you will go to America or Germany or whatever other country. So I'm an immigrant. And I came here myself. I chose it. I was lucky. I came here, started a job. Everything was amazing. Still, immigration is extremely stressful. Now, one day you know that you're going to be in another country, that you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know much about them. And then you come in here, of course, they don't put you in Grosse Pointe, right? So it's going to be a very unhappy neighborhood. We had people who had drug dealers and prostitutes in the same building that they live. And you have to start navigating everything. And actually, kids have a big role here because kids are the ones who pick it up quickly. Kids are more advanced with the technology. So now data. Now that we talked about people, now data on those people. So we had a relatively even group in terms of like half and half, male and female, finely educated, mostly married, and no previous psychiatric diagnosis. Doesn't mean that they didn't have it. It means that, well, no attention. So in refugees, by default, we can imagine that there has been no previous treatment or appreciation of their condition. So when we talk about PTSD, what is PTSD? It's again a concept. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a condition when a person is exposed to extreme adverse experiences that can negatively impact everybody. And those people will end up with nightmares, continuous nightmares, flashbacks, extreme fear, anxiety, easily startled, cannot go out, cannot be social. And almost always depression is part of the whole story. You already don't have the energy, you're terrified, you cannot venture and go out and learn new things. So more than 30% of our adults screen positive for post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the other things I hate about PTSD research is that there's a spectrum of symptom severity, right? Let's say from 0 to 100. We draw a line here and say whoever's above here is PTSD. The other ones are resilient. As if a person whose score is 40 on the screener is much different than the one who scored 39, and this one is PTSD and this one is resilient. So when we see 30-some%, it doesn't mean that the rest are like extremely happy. Just a comparison point, the prevalence of PTSD, lifetime prevalence of PTSD among Vietnam War veterans is 30%. The prevalence of anxiety and depression are high, of course higher in women. I think this is relevant because we also, one of my interests is looking at the personal meaning of experiences, how the way I interpret and how the meaning I develop for the trauma affects the way I'm traumatized, separate from the objectivity of trauma. So we asked a couple of simple questions about the subjective experience of how hard was it? How do you experience your health? The right side is not very relevant to our discussion now, but the left side, just the way the person perceived the experience, no matter what the objective trauma was, highly correlates with their PTSD symptoms, anxiety, and depression. So the perception that the person creates and that we create for them highly affects the people. So quickly going to the children refugee data now, which is more related. Interestingly, moms do buffer impact of trauma here. We didn't get a lot of PTSD with kids. The conditioning didn't happen. What we did get, actually before we go there, kids also, like majority had both of their parents, so they come like within a fine family structure. What we saw was raw anxiety. So more than 50% of our kids are highly anxious. And what is most important here is nearly 80% have separation anxiety. What is separation anxiety? I mean, have any of you remember when you were a kid, you didn't want to go to school? You were terrified to be separated from mom and stomach pain would happen. These kids are terrified to be separated from their parents. Why? Because it's a normal reaction. When you are in a minefield, what would you do? You would either freeze or just exactly follow the steps of the person who knows the area. And who's that person for a kid? Mom or dad? Do you want to be, when the more the threat, the closer you want to stick to the source of protection. We talked to a few school districts where they serve Middle Eastern refugee kids. Number one problem teacher said, we cannot bring kids here. We cannot keep him here. Well, we mentioned the interventions that we have. We have been doing, because we can't do psychotherapy. Medications are difficult in Middle Eastern population, also accepting it and side effects. So we developed interventions that we had to bring a mom and a kid together. And moms in this room would do mindful yoga, and kids would do dance and art and movement therapies in the next two rooms because of the separation anxiety. And gradually, assimilation happened, anxiety went down, and they were more comfortable. We had to do that. So now, imagine having gone through all those danger and threat and the other interesting fact, all symptoms of a distressing mom correlated with those of kids. So these are related, these feed to each other. And when we look at so in the children's separation, we look at I'll try to finish it in 1 more minute. We look at kids, we talk about kids. Don't talk much about moms. There are moms here. Imagine how it would feel. And then looking at the context is important. These people did not come from Sweden, where their human rights are absolutely served all their life and they know what their right is. So a lot of people come from authoritarian societies where a police is a terrifying person to look at. An authority with a gun is terrorizing. And that fear conditioning has already happened in both parents and kids. And then all of a sudden, you're totally, with that extreme anxiety that you bring, you have to be there. So what I'm trying to say is that separating these kids, to me, would be like throwing a person who's afraid of snakes in a room filled with snakes. And I have to thank all the people. A lot of people put their time invested for volunteer work and amazing dedication. We even had a Holocaust survivor who called and said, this really resonated with what I experienced as a kid. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Arash. It's my pleasure now to introduce Vivek Sankaran, who I have the pleasure of working with as a consultant to the Child Advocacy Law Clinic, where he is the director at the UM School of Law of both the Child Advocacy Law Clinic and the Child Welfare Appellate Clinic. And through these clinics, law students represent children and parents in trial and appellate proceedings. Professor Sankaran has written numerous articles focused on improving the child welfare system and has litigated cases before the Michigan Supreme Court. In addition, he conducts state and national trainings and works on child welfare initiatives with various national groups, including the American Bar Association, Casey Family Programs, and the National Center for State Courts. And I think it's really a delight to have Vivek here with us today, bringing a different perspective, but one that I think is really critical for us all to consider as we think about sort of translation and advocacy and relevant issues intersecting with all of what we've been talking about. So please join me in welcoming Vivek.
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me here. I'm going to try to keep my remarks as brief as possible to make sure that we have time to have a conversation. One of the things that always strikes me whenever I come to sessions like this, where you hear this research all sort of leading to one conclusion, is how frequently my system, the legal system, has no clue, right, on a lot of the things that we're talking about. And one of the things that I'm just so happy that Kate reached out to me was I think part of our challenge here is to bridge this gap. Right, every day I work in juvenile courts, in both here locally, but I also do a lot of work across the country. And perhaps they'll be shocked, or perhaps not, that many of the actors within our systems have no clue about the research that you're talking about. You know, the stuff that Kate was talking about, well, they're only young children. It's okay if we remove them because they remember. You know, I suspect the folks in this room sort of smile like, how can anyone possibly think that? People actually do think that in my world. You hear that from lawyers, judges, all sorts of stakeholders. You'll see that written in appellate opinions. all the time, that just doesn't matter. And so I think one of our challenges is really to bridge that gap and bridge that divide and figure out how we can disseminate this information to the systems that are exacting this sort of these actions on these families. And I hope we can talk about some of that in our conversation. What I wanted to do, I'm not an immigration lawyer. If anyone has questions about immigration law, I can take a good guess. That's not my core work. I work in the foster care system here. What I wanted to do, though, is give a little bit of a contrast to what it is that how my system handles removals, at least sort of our legal structures we have created, to show the contrast between the laws that we have extended to anyone who's actually in the United States as it deals with separations, how we're handling the situation involving these families at the border. One of the strongest constitutional principles we have in the United States is the right of parents to care for their children. Right? Since the early 1900s, the U.S. Supreme Court has consistently talked about sort of the zone of family autonomy, right? That parents get to make decisions for their children. The government needs to stay out of the family unit. In fact, one of the reasons why the U.S. still remains one of the few countries, I think it's the U.S. and Somalia, that refuses to sign the UN Convention of Human Rights, Children's Rights, is because of this sort of strong commitment that we have to the right of parents to make decisions with children, which is just ironic, right? Given our recent behaviors on the border, that it's completely undermining what our commitment has been in the country to the idea of family unity. If you look at the laws in my system, the child protective system, the laws in the books are written to protect the family unit, if at all possible. So examples of that, under both federal law and state law, before a child can be removed from the parent, the government has to make what they call reasonable efforts to protect the child at home. And so how does that work in practice? It often works that child welfare agencies have to provide services to identify a problem, have to at least try to work with the family in non-extreme circumstances to provide parenting classes, therapy, mental health services, substance abuse treatment, whatever it is. So the idea that removing the child from the home is a remedy of last resort. One of the undercurrents in my system is that you don't remove a child to punish you. Right? People often sort of forget that in my world, but the idea is that you have a criminal system there that is all about punishment, deterrence. Child protective system is all about taking whatever action is necessary to protect a child. Second, if a child is removed, our laws, for the most part across the country, require nearly an immediate court hearing. Right, within 24 to 72 hours in most states, you're in front of a judge, where a judge, in theory, is supposed to review these. Go down to the juvenile court, just a short walk from here, every afternoon at 2 o'clock. Have these hearings down in juvenile court. At that hearing, you have a judge, a lawyer representing the parent, a lawyer representing the child, all who have a chance to challenge the removal. Contrast that to what's going on in the border, which is no right to counsel, no right to any sort of immediate judicial review. And thank goodness for the sort of the pro bono spirit in the legal community, where floods of lawyers are headed down to the border. But that's all out of their goodwill, right? That's the idea of professional obligation. But there's no right to any of this for our laws. And so essentially, the government retains the right to abruptly disrupt these families at any sort of due process, which really cuts against the core of the structures that we've set up for people in this country. Even if the judge, you have a chance to challenge removals, my students do that all the time in court. Even with that happening, and a child has to be placed in foster care, first the law looks to relatives, right, as a way to mitigate whatever stresses may exist. And we do a pretty decent job of that here in Michigan. If there's a parent in the country, in the system, who isn't accused of abuse or neglect, we would immediately place the child with that parent. And then there's a sense of continued contact, right? The idea that if a child is placed in foster care, to mitigate that trauma, all this research that we've been presented with today, is to keep frequent continuing communication via phone, in person, whatever that is, to mitigate the harms that this would have on the child. And then an essential part of our system is continued review. Right? I mean, the core is sort of the idea of due process, that even if a child is removed, we come back to court every 2 to 3 weeks. And a question that the good judges ask all the time is, why does this child have to be in foster care? And eventually our system proceeds to reunify the family if at all possible by providing services that address the risks. So I raise all of these issues just to sort of flag sort of just the dissonance going on between the systems we've created that, at least on paper, have signs of due process, because it's something that our country has believed in for a long time, with how now we're exacting this remedy on these families at the border. Now, all that being said, if you read anything that I've ever written, I'm incredibly harsh on our foster care system, right? So because there's a real disconnect between what's on paper and what's actually happening. I wanted to at least spend a minute and then hopefully have a discussion about why I think that is. If you look at on paper, in practice, about 250,000 children each year in this country are removed by Child Protective Services. These are all essentially poor families. The Child Protective System in this country is not about taking away people in my neighborhood who are might be abusing their children, because there's private mechanisms that they'll get lawyers and they'll deal with their problems privately. It's a system for poor families, minority families, families that basically don't have any sort of means to speak up. A lot of the systems that I've described are underfunded. Yes, people have a right generally to lawyers, but they're underpaid, have high caseloads. If you go down to the Washington County Juvenile Court on 2 o'clock, you will see lawyers talking with their clients for a couple of minutes for a court hearing to remove a child, essentially inflicting this catastrophic trauma on this child. And the hearings last maybe 4 to 6 minutes. Even though everyone recognizes that the need to thoroughly engage in a conversation about this before we do it. Once a child is placed in foster care, on average, they remain in foster care probably for 8 to 13 months. In Michigan, there's no sense of any sort of urgency at all to reunify the family. And most removals in the United States happen without the court first reviewing it. So most happen by the cops pull the child out, caseworkers take the child away. So by the time we all get to court, the child has already been in foster care for several days without any review. And the dynamics on the ground is such that there's a status quo bias. That once a child is removed, the child remains removed till for a considerable amount. So I don't want you to walk away thinking, boy, if only these families at the border have all these great protections that our families in the U.S. can have. As a practical matter, yet, that's not what I mean. But at least on paper, though, we as a society recognize the rights that families should be afforded. And one of my hopes in this, if there's any sort of silver lining in this sort of a horrible couple of months we've had in this country as it relates to this, is that the mental health community and the medical community have really spoken out about the impact of removal. For the first time, so there's a unified voice since I've been doing this work. I've been doing it for about 17 years or so. And what I'm hoping is that we take this research that has sort of emerged and been publicized because of the conversation as it relates to those at the border, and start doing a little bit of introspection about our own systems. Because it's been, for those of us who represent parents and families in the system, there's been a little bit of irony about some of the loudest voices who have been really, in a great way, publicly out there about how horrible the separation has been, because some of them have been the harshest and most interventionist when it comes to families of color and minority families in the U.S. about the value of placing kids in foster care. And so I just hope that we can use this research to have a real conversation about how we recalibrate this tool we have of removal, make sure that only those families or those children that truly need to be removed are actually removed. The last thing I also wanted to end on is sort of my view of why there's this constant disconnect between research and practice as it relates to these families, and I see it in the foster care system, is that so long as we view the families across the border, or the families, poor minority families in the foster care system as the other, right, which is not us in this room, but those people, we're never going to then be able to, this research will always seem distant. And that's my biggest fear is, and part of my work now has really been to try to showcase how those people are no different than us. They have the same sort of hopes and dreams and challenges that I have for my 3 kids. But that's the sell. Because the research for me is clear, but I think that there's just this sort of pervasive view that, yes, but those relationships only apply in functional. These families just aren't functional, so therefore that research isn't available. And I see it every day in terms of how my system treats the families before us. And so I think that while there is the challenge of getting this research before my judges and my agency directors, a big part of the onus is on lawyers and other storytellers is to get these stories out, to get people and to get more connected with these. So I'm going to stop there, and then hopefully we have some time for questions.
And have a seat. So first of all, I just want to thank you so much for this really wonderful set of presentations, so rich, and I think bringing multiple perspectives to the work, and I hope we all appreciate that actually, we've crossed a lot of boundaries that often exist. Animal rodent models of sort of fear conditioning as it relates to, sort of understanding with quantitative data, but also personalizing it, the experiences of refugees, the policy implications, qualitative research, I think quite a rich compendium. And I think that given that we have these really terrific thought partners here, rather than my posing questions, I might first just ask if any of you, as you were listening, you sort of had a chance to think about this and what you wanted to bring to the table, and now you've heard others. If you have questions for the panel, before we turn it over to open Q&A.
Just had a thought.
Okay.
And I was thinking if there's a way when listening to you to bring the military personnel parents into the discussion, because that will be very strong. These people come and talk about it. That's very different than when I talk about it, both for the public and the government.
So actually, I think your point really harkens on what you left us with, in that I think it was strategic. My work on family separations and disruptions and repair spans foster care, adoption, other kinds of experiences. But I think strategically, when we were thinking about our op-ed and sort of the message that we wanted to get out, it was actually quite intentional to draw on the work with the military families because of what you were describing. That in fact, there isn't the same necessarily us-them distinction that gets drawn that allows people to distance from the reality of the emotional experience and the reality of the implications. And in fact, all families have common experiences actually around these kinds of traumatic or very stressful separations and the challenges that they face on repair. So I think, it was an intentional decision to go that route. And certainly, I guess the other thing is to sort of, we can't depoliticize anything. Everything is political. But I think to sort of take this picture and say, this is a big issue that affects children and families nationally, and how can we learn from what we have already seen, heard, lived, learned, and experienced to help us understand how we can do better, right?
Yeah, just to build on that point, one of the biggest stories in the last decade, basically the only time anyone has talked about removal in the foster care system, in fact, was when a U of M professor went to a Tigers game and it was a dumb mistake and gave his kid Mike's Hard Lemonade, and the police were called, and eventually the child was removed for about 4 days before they were returned home. That goes to your point, which is almost strategically picking people who, when this happens to someone who is powerful, right, has resources, they then have, that's the reason our law changed in Michigan and made it a little more stringent to standard, at least, to remove a child from a home. I think that's part of the challenge is to get voices like that, whether it's military families or folks who somehow get enmeshed in the child welfare system, to have their children talk about it and talk about it. And you draw people in.
I would like, it's a comment, since this was mentioned, that one of the arguments that judges used in the court is that little children do not remember. Indeed, there is a phenomenon described as infantile amnesia, that early learning in life is not lasting unless there's repetition over time. There are neural mechanisms being identified that underlie it. It's related to brain maturation, neurogenesis, perineural nets. But one of the most important things that I think the judge misses is that there are various memory systems in the brain. And explicit memories, they do require such areas like hippocampus that develop neocortex to last, to be encoded and last. However, the survival-related systems, like the amygdala that I mentioned, and other associated areas, they are maturing much earlier. So we don't explicitly remember separation, but we do respond to cues that remind us of trauma. And this is something that doesn't look like that. This whole science of unconscious, maybe not in the Freudian meaning of the word, but how it's conceptualized by contemporary psychology and neuroscience, it's really missing. What is another important thing to maybe add is that physical wounds, disabilities are obvious because we see them immediately. Many of these psychological disabilities, these are invisible wounds, and we see them in the context. When somebody is under stress or there is perceived stress, perceived threat, so we see them through the behaviors that are being displayed and reaction. And that's, my guess is that the judges, when they want to have everything explicit, written on paper, well, that's not so explicit because you have to consider what is implicit and look into the context.
So it's interesting. I'm curious, as I was listening, I was struck by something, which is how often what we hear in the press and in the media pertains to the impact on the infants or young children. And yet, part of what I've been hearing each of you speak to is really this critical focus on parents being necessary, that parents are a protective buffer, that they may help to disrupt the fear conditioning and the fear of learning, is that parents' reactions and responses are associated with young kids. So I'm sort of curious if you might think either about that or other things that sort of maybe surprised you. It really got me thinking about how do we also expand the lens to focus on parents' adjustments, parents' reactions. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about that, or if there were other things that sort of jumped out at you as forgotten or not as attended to in the context of these presentations.
I think part of this focus on children could be political because the political argument is that parents did the fault and they came here. Mm-hmm. Now it's like all the kids didn't have a fault, but there's no fault on the parents too, who is worried their child is going to be kidnapped or killed today, or that same could happen to the whole family. So, and of course, it's important to see this as a unit of distress. The whole family is a unit of distress, and each of them take it in a different way. Like in our group, father's symptoms did not relate to those of kids, but it doesn't mean that fathers are disconnected. To us, it means that that father has a different role in this survival mode family. And when they are separate, so as much as there's stress on the kid, the same stress is worsening the situation. Parents, even after you unify them, you have caused the damage. We also know about the impact of stress hormones and all the HPA axis and what it can do to your hippocampus and what happens at the developmental stage of life of the kid. One other thing is that, well, we're talking about the level of stress right now, then, well, this kid was stressed for a long time, for whatever, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then back to normal life. But I'm not sure that's normal life. So some of the impacts may not easily be reversed, both biological and psychological.
I mean, the two reactions I had to your question was, one, in the child welfare system, we often use the parent's reaction after removal as a reason to continue the removal, right? Because of the way that they manifest their trauma, their fear, the depression. And so it's almost really cruel that we know that this is the reaction that a lot of parents will have. Well, the other thought I had, and this is really in your research, Kate, about the military families, is how little time we spend in systems thinking about what happens after the families are reunified, and how that actually is a moment that needs a lot of support and work as well. And so it's as if, we've inflicted this trauma on this family unit that was already experiencing instability, which then will create additional challenges. But then we think that we've made the family whole again by simply bringing them back together and letting them go on with their lives. And the reality is that there's a lot of work still needs to be done. In my system, we'll have a child in foster care for 12 to 15 months, and then we'll send the child home, and within weeks or months, we'll just close the case and be done, saying, well, this family's good. We spend very little time thinking about, and then if you look at the rates of reoccurrence of maltreatment, it's incredibly high. Families, kids coming back into the system. And it really strikes me as maybe perhaps one of the reasons that happens. We don't do that follow-up work at all. Kind of sort of help the family heal and things.
So I wonder if we might now actually turn it to questions from the audience. And I've seen hands going up, one back there, then here, then there.
Well, I think the research on these families. I wonder if we could shift the frame from that research and the necessary education. I mean, the education is necessary, but clearly not sufficient in the context where we know papers from the Office of Refugee Resettlement shows that 25,000 new beds are being planned for in internment camps, concentration camps, however you want to term. And that's not hyperbole calling it that. Andrea Pitzer, who's the foremost authority on it, called it that. So if you would be willing, Julie, Kate, Lindsay, and others, if I could share some of the material ways in which we could support not only families that are being separated, but examples of direct action organizations that are on the front lines of this work, trying to change the reality. Because I think, if not, it just becomes an academic exercise where we're appalled, but it's a continuing horror that we're bearing witness to and complicit in if we don't act in some ways. So, I mean, there are lots of organizations, Nihende, locally, rights. They have a training this Friday that I'd like to plug really quickly at the School of Social Work from 6 to 8:30. I can send information with a compilation of all of
Could you do that? I think the Wicker event or other things that are happening, it would be great to have that. And then we can sort of, one of the beauties of the fact that you all had, we know who's here and can reach out to, and you can let us know if you want to receive materials or have an ongoing discussion around things. We welcome that. So thank you for your point.
And there is a list of organizations that are doing work at the border, a kind of compiled list at emergentfund.net. Yeah. If you just want to use that URL as a collated course. So thank you for the opportunity to
Thank you for bringing that to this discussion. Thanks.
Yes, I just have one comment to kind of following what you said is why is it that we are kind of shutting out parents or kind of in some way, and I think I'm kind of, this is maybe a philosophical answer in some way, but I'm grappling with this because I work with traumatized individuals, families, and trying to help them connect with their children and kind of trying to understand them. And I have a sense that the way how we look at behaviors that are different, that we don't understand, is that we either label them as bad or mad. And that's a way to distance and to kind of judge and to then say it has a blaming or a distancing perspective. Whereas that's in order kind of to then separate the infant or the young child as the innocence, the new beginning, the hope, and so in some way you then don't want to contaminate these innocent, loving little infants from this bad and mad parent. And so that's why the whole idea, in some way, on one side you have this ideal scenario of, yeah, parents should be together with their families. Yeah, if everything is wonderful, it's this poster picture family values, it's all on paper. But when it doesn't go that way, there's an easy say, get those mad and bad parents out there. And instead of helping them, let's just put these like innocent kids who don't remember. Let's start, it's a blank slate. Let's start from scratch somewhere else. And it's kind of this, it's a bigger thinking. We are not into repair in this country or in this society. We're into new, we buy new, we do new. It's a little bit scratched, you throw it away and start from scratch. And so I have to say, I think that there's a bigger philosophy, and yes, we need to do more education. We have to destigmatize. It's injured, it's scratched, and it can be repaired. There can be repair, but it needs nurture, it needs love. And I think that that's what we need to drive home, that it's not all about quick fixes, and if that doesn't work, move it on. So sorry if this was lengthy.
And just on that point, I mean, I think that our country has a long history of this idea of taking kids away from the bad, angry parents, right? In the 1900s, we had the orphan trains. We had taking kids from poor families and sending them out west. Native American families, it wasn't even a subtle policy. It was intentional to, not teach them their language, to put them on, so I think that there's a lot to be said about the fact that all this stuff only applies to a certain cohort of people, and for the rest, let's try to save as opposed to repair or help, do the hard work it takes to keep that family together.
Come through the government as an idealized parent.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop us here because it is noon, but I guess I first want to say, like, from the bottom of my heart, I think you could tell from my facial expression during these, like, this was, there was a lot of emotion that came out of these, a lot of feeling. So much for coming. It is noon, and so I am tasked with wrapping us up on this note and like breaking up this conversation now. But what I'd like us to do is, you are welcome to stay and mingle, and I hope that the speakers talk with members of the audience and some more amongst themselves. I really love the idea of, we don't want to just be an ivory tower. So please let's stay in communication and see what can we do to translate some things to action. And I also, you will all be getting an email from the Center for Human Growth and Development because we are interested in engaging more members to become part of this community so that we can do more training. And my last note is that if anyone in the audience sees something come up in the news or the media or something that affects children's lives, please contact us here at the Center for Human Growth and Development and say, I think this needs a rapid response. And we can work to administratively organize it. We just need your ideas. And so on that note, I'm going to stop us, but please stay, have some coffee, have some tea, have some snacks, and chat with our speakers and amongst yourselves. Thank you so much.